Okay. I'm going to talk really quickly through how the class itself works. Um, One of the things I kind of want to do is as I create tools that become available for my team or other folks to use, I want everything to have a similar handwriting. I don't want you to have to learn a whole new style of interacting with APIs or routes or whatever. I would like you to be able to comfortably make some assumptions about the library that I'm using. So I basically wrote a wrapper that says, hey, Google has released this library called Google. Google has released a library called Google API Client. I don't want you to have to learn a ton of new tools. Let me be the wrapper that encapsulates these other tools and makes available to you something that feels similar because it all has the same handwriting. Why can't I push my chair in?
I don't know, but I found these results on search.
Thanks. Okay, so as you would expect, everything's written in a series of root functions and class functions. So for example, let's talk through generate creds from file. Um, Returns is ga credentials. Okay, so this root function returns something from Google's credentials, a class called credentials, which I didn't write, Google wrote that. But the credentials class is necessary for interacting with APIs. So what I wrote is I said, hey, if you're storing your client information or token information in a local file, in a JSON file, then what we're going to do is we're going to try to run from authorized user file, which again, I didn't write, but this is a class method that returns an instance of the credentials class. If you can pass a token path and a valid scope. So by default, my default scope is going to, not by default, my default. The default scope will be this. These are the things that my library needs access to. And let's take a quick look at my token. So my token says, hey, I've already authenticated with my username and password to Google's OAuth 2 login screen. You know that screen like when you're in Spotify, right? And you click on Spotify and you're like, hey, I want to log in, and they're like, hey, you can use these other providers to authenticate. So you can authenticate using Facebook. You can use authenticate using Google. And when you click on your Google account, it takes you to a page that looks like Google and it says confirm your username or password and click the things you want to allow this app to do. So what you're functionally clicking is you're saying, hey, when I go through your OAuth 2 login screen, I want to give Python the ability to interact with my metadata, to interact with Google Drive and read and files and so on. That's what this does. Now, as all good things, a token has an expiration date. That's why I'm comfortable putting this on the internet. But this is how I can allow Python to log in as me and do stuff, is with this token. Now, if I don't have a token yet, and on day one you won't have a token, but if you wanted to be able to log in against Jay Wilson's Domo library testing project, right, I would have had to give you permission and shared stuff with you, blah, blah, blah. But then you could create a token that does the thing. Or you can set up your own client ID and secret combo for your own Google project. Again, this is all documented on the internet, but it's also somewhat in here. So let's say, hypothetically, I'm running generate creds from files. If you pass in a token path to the env token um, file, what it'll do is it'll generate an instance of creds. And if you have creds, now we're going to test and see if these creds are good or if I need to regenerate them. So if I have creds and the creds are valid, which only Google knows, then great, move forward with our lives, we're happy. But if I have creds, but they are expired, which is, I assume, a Boolean, and I have a refresh token, which tells me this guy. where is it? Refresh token, which gives me a pathway to refresh my token. Cool. Then run the method refresh, passing in an instance of the request class, which again is Google wrote. I don't know anything about it. And once it runs successfully, return creds. Fantastic. Again, this is a wrapper so that you don't have to understand any of this stuff. Like you don't have to understand when do I need to refresh or anything like that. This is just boilerplate wrapped in JWilson code. Now, if none of these things happen, then I need to run a flow. And what the flow does is it runs you through the process of generating a new token. Well, how do you generate a new token? What is a flow? A flow uses your client ID and secret and passes in a default scope and says, hey, I need you to direct JWilson to click on this I can just show you. I'm going to take out the token path so that I just have the client. Oh, okay, come on. So let's say you're running a project from scratch. Token path really is required. All right. Oh no. Rewrite everything, guys. Can you just work? Okay, so if you don't have a token, you're like, hey, you're trying to access this project. What credentials do you want to use to access this project? So then I say, oh, I want to use my username and password. And then it says, hey, this project has these scopes. Is that okay? And I'm going to click allow. And then it says, hey, authentication flow completed. And then it's going to send a new token back to Google. And then it says problems. So let's create a default value instead of none. All right, let's try that again. No, sends it back. Flow completed. Go back to Google. And then now I have my new token file that it just sent back to me. Cool. So that's how a token flow works if you don't have a token. Or auth flow works if you don't have a token. Cool. And we have the same option for generate creds from the .env. Cool. So what's the class, right? We've talked through the roots. In terms of the class, the Google Auth class has an instance of creds. I'm going to make this required. Why wouldn't it be? The Google Auth class has an instance of creds. It has the default scope, and it has the class methods, generate from .env and generate from file. That part we understand, we've spoken through. Now, what about service? What is a service? The service is the thing, the resource is what it's called, that allows me to interact with Google Drive or Google Docs or Google Sheets. And a service exchanges, so when I go build, and build is another Google function, the build function is a class method, if you will, that returns an instance of a resource that says, hey, these are the creds I want you to use. this is the version of the API that I want you to use, and this is this name of the service. So I can go to Google Drive version 3 or version 2 or version 1 if it hasn't been deprecated. And this allows me to interact with different versions of the Sheets, Docs, etc. API. I'm going to restart and run everything just to make sure that I didn't break anything permanently. Yeah, this should all be good. Please be good. Sweet. So that's Google Auth. In terms of Google Drive, same concept, a series of roots and classes. So I start by generating my auth object, and then I can create a service. Now, I've written storing the service into the class, so hopefully we don't have to deal with that. So when I interact with Google Drive says, hey, when you want to get a file by, I should rename this. When you interact with Google Drive, what fields do you want to extract, right? Get me a list of all the files in Google Drive. Okay, what fields do you want? I want the ID, a link, a URL to the asset, the name of the asset, what type of asset it is, and when was it last time it was modified. If you said, hey, I want to add the created time, then you can modify that by passing in fields to your get by ID function. Okay, so how does get file by ID work? It says use the service that you passed in, which is a Google resource, which I didn't create. Call the files method, then call the get method. And when you get, pass in, or sorry, retrieve these fields. Execute query. Service.files is not asynchronous. It does it one at a time. But I wrote get file by ID as asynchronous so that I can run multiple instances of get file by ID at the same time. If I wrote this as a synchronous function, then if I wanted to retrieve 100 files, it would take forever. Okay, and then parentless, arguably this should not be in the root function. This is a class thing to say, what is my list of parents? We can debate that a different day. All right, so when I call get file by ID, I pass in, like I said, the service. I don't pass an auth object, which is kind of different from Domo library. I pass in the service because the service already knows or includes auth information, right? That's the token we pass back and forth. Okay, but here I can say pass in this file ID, and here I get back what's new with Andrea Henderson. That's the document. It is of type Google App Stock. This is the parent. This is where it came from. And then this is the modification that I added, which I'm thinking about deprecating. Okay. Now, if I want to get folder contents, right, get me a listing of all of the folders. This is interesting because this is a loop function. A loop function is like, you know, when I say get me all of the files in a folder, I can't retrieve all 2,000 files at the same time. Google would be unhappy. And so it adds a field called next page token, which says, I'll give you 100 at a time. If you want the next 100, you have to run the same query again, but pass in the next page token. And so down here we can see, hey, when I call my service.files, I'm going to ask for a list. And I'm going to limit my query to 10 docs at a time, receive or return my query results passing in page token. And what is page token? Well, when I create my loop, I'll say while true, run the query, store it as a response. and the page token is the response.get next page token. If there's no page token, break out of the loop. And then as I loop through this set of queries, take response.get files and add them to an object called file list. And file list is ultimately what we're going to return. So down here, again, I've done some extra stuff that I'm not sure I'm super happy with, where I'm adding the parent list to each file. And again, I'm doing that so that I can build this idea of recursive history, but I think this might no longer be necessary. And then I have a Boolean flag. If the file is of type folder, then add a Boolean is folder equals true. And then I return my file list. Oof, I do not like that. So what I'll do is, like I've done everywhere else, I'm going to add return raw. And I'll say, here, if return raw, return file ls. No, I'll modify it. I'll say if return raw, response files is equal to file return response. Okay. So if you said return raw, take the last response and modify file to equal the file list, and then return the response. Do I instantiate? Which means I have to instantiate response up here. Okay. Spacing. Cool. Otherwise, return the response list. So this is the thing, and if I say return raw equals true, this is the format of the original API response, which is files, and there is no next page token because we got to the end. Okay, I'm happy with that. Happier. Okay. Walk and flatten. Walk and flatten is a recursive function that retrieves all files in the subfolders. I implemented this for an old way of handling crawling Google Drive that I don't use anymore, that takes advantage of parent list. So I have reasons why I don't love this and don't use it anymore. But we also have a function called walk folder, which is a cleaner implementation. That will return information about the folder, including so this is like the get files implementation, and then here are the children of that folder. In terms of handling export, when you want to export a file, you can call export file as. Again, you need your service, you need your file ID, and then what is your export function? How do you want to handle exporting? I should indicate this is of type callable. And this is, the placeholder is of type bool. The output path is of type string. Ooh, documentation could have been better. Export MIME type is of type add callable. Mr. Wilson, sloppy on documenting. Okay, walk folders, here we are. The result of walk folder is a list of thingies, and we were talking about MIME typing them. So I wanted to make it a little bit easier. So like when you say, hey, I want to output a markdown, it says, hey, this is what I need to pass to the API in order to export it as a markdown. If you said, I want to export it as a zip file, this is what you need to pass to the API as the content type or the MIME type of a zip file. In any case, when I call the function export file as, what happens is I use my service, I run the function export, I pass in the file ID, and I say, hey, how do you want to export it? What is the MIME type? So text/markdown or text/HTML, whatever. How do you download that file? Once you download that file, what do you want to do with it? So this is my export function. I can either just return the content that I got from the API, or if I pass in a callable function, it will call said function, passing in content equals content, and where is the output folder. So if you wanted to export something as a PowerPoint, you would say, call export file as, pass in the service, pass in the file ID. The MIME type is predefined, and the export function is download PowerPoint. Now, where is that? Download PowerPoint is a utility function under utils files. Oh, yes. And so how does it work? It receives content, it receives an output folder, and it says, hey, upsert the file location, and then the content will be binary. So then how do I handle writing binary? These are questions you don't need to ever ask yourself. My function kind of handles it for us. We're using a wrapper around PowerPoint X to Markdown as well to convert this into Markdown. So again, I wrote this utility function so that I never have to think about how do I download a Markdown or how do I download a PowerPoint. And I don't have to think about how do I download a zip file. Again, when I want to download a zip file, I will use a library called zip file. I'll take that bytes.io, binary, I believe, binary content, convert it into a zip, run the extract. Like again, all of this stuff you don't have to worry about. And then the process of converting it to Markdown, if you want it, you don't have to worry about it. It's wrapped in a utility function. So coming back to G Drive, we're saying, hey, the first half of this function interacts with the Google Drive APIs for getting the content. The export function says, okay, I've got the content. What do you want to do with it? So that gets handled by the export function. And one of the things I like about this implementation is someday you might say, hey, Jay, I want a clean way to download my file as a Markdown. And the next day you might say, I want it as a PDF. Okay, cool. The process of interacting with the API doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the export function. So as long as I set up the export function to always receive a content and always receive an output path, I can take it and in this function do whatever I want, right? Sorry, in this function, do whatever I want as long as it receives those two parameters. And then all I have to do is build a wrapper around export file as, and I can say export it as a PowerPoint, export it as a zip, and I can add another function called export as a PDF. What this allows me to do is it allows me to avoid a bunch of if statements. If the type is PDF, then do this. If the type is PPTX, do that. We don't really want that because that would mean that this export file function would get really bloated. And every time I wanted to add a new export method, I would have to add more to the if statement down here. By passing in an export function, it gives me the ability to parameterize my code, which I think is a cleaner way of writing. Oh my God. So then to the class methods. GDriveFile is a base class that receives several attributes, and as always, we have the getById class method. So in getById, I receive the ID of the document or folder. I say what is the auth that I want to use, but more importantly, what is the service? And then what fields do I want to retrieve? So we'll say, hey, retrieve these Google Drive fields and call super getById. And you might be wondering, why do you have a super? We'll talk through that in a second. So in the super getById, which is a private method, a private class method, we're going to say, hey, you passed in a service. Now, in order to do the next step, you have to have a GDrive service. So either pull in the right one or get one from auth. Cool. So then we're going to run the root function, getFileById, requesting these fields. I lied. I'm going to move this to here. This will make sense in a second. Okay, so I request these fields. When I request these fields, I'm going to get the file by ID, and then if return raw, return the response, or create an instance of the class, in our case, the Google Drive file class. Fantastic. That's get by ID. Why do I have super? I have super because theoretically, I could have a class that's based off of Google Drive, but maybe it's a different subclass. So an example of a subclass might be Google Drive folder as opposed to Google Drive file. Now, because it's based off of Google Drive file, I'm inheriting all of the methods of Google Drive file, but I'm adding some interesting things. I'm adding the ability to have an attribute called Google Drive files, which will have my list of Google Drive file. Additionally, I can add a method called getFiles, which will call the root function walk folder and recursively walk the folder and get a list of the files within that folder. And then I can also run getChild from JSON, which will, if this is recursive, get the children of the folder and do all of that recursive, folder within folder stuff. Okay, but that doesn't explain super get by ID. So the super is, I might have another class called Google Doc. And Google Doc will actually interact with the Google Docs API. The Google Docs APIs are different from Google Drive. Let's just be clear about that. You'll see here that the service that we're calling is service.documents, as opposed to when I'm interacting with Google Drive. Sorry. Come on. Service.files is the Google Drive API, as opposed to service.documents is a Google Docs API. Okay, so when I interact with the Google Docs API, I'm saying, hey, I want to get this document ID, and maybe I want to include these tabs. And the response from the Google Docs API is the actual structure of the document, like all of the stuff you would see in HTML. Heading 1, what is the content? What is the spacing? Is it bold and whatnot? That's the Google Docs API. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I wanted to talk about this idea of super. So, the Google Doc class is based off of Google Drive file. So it inherits all of the properties of Google Drive file, including get by ID. But I need to overwrite get by ID. I don't want to use Google Drive's get by ID. I want one that's special for Google Docs. So you'll still pass the document ID, you'll pass the auth and service, but I might want to know about this tab content. So what happens in get by ID? Let's take a look. So here, instead of generating a Google Drive service, I need a Google Docs service. Step 1. I'm going to call get document by ID, which hits the Google Docs API and gives me all of the information about Google Docs. So real quick, let me do run all, and hopefully this still works. I'm going to say return raw equals true. Export file as download markdown received output folder. Download markdown received output folder, and you didn't like it. Where is download markdown defined? This is in the wrong place. Oh, because it wasn't completely implemented. Hilarious. Lord have mercy. Okay. Oh, that's because I was working on something that didn't pan out. So here I'm calling get by ID. Here I said return raw equals true. So here's the API response. Again, get by ID, get document by ID hits the Google Docs API and just returns the structure of the document. It doesn't tell you the parent structure, all of the Google Drive stuff. It gives you the Google Docs stuff, but not the Google Drive stuff. So once I get document by ID, I now need a Google Drive service to hit Google Drive. And I'll say, hey, I need to create an instance of the result of super get by ID, which again comes from Google Drive. Okay, so when I call super get by ID, it's going to create an instance of the class from JSON with all of this stuff, which is a Google Drive specific information, not a Google Docs specific information. So now I have an instance of the Google Drive class. Well, it's actually a GDoc class, but I called the super from Gdrive file. So now I have an instance of the class, and I can say, hey, I got a response from this API, and I want to take that content. I'm going to call this, let me rename this. I want to take the body, I want to take the content and store it as a GDoc content from JSON. That's my GDoc body. And then I'm going to return an instance of, take my class, call from JSON, passing in this stuff. So did I overwrite from JSON for Google Drive? I actually don't remember. I'm passing in a new argument into from JSON, and I'm calling from JSON from Google Drive. So if I call Google Drive, where's my from JSON? The from JSON, here, that's interesting. I was smart. I said, hey, I might use the from JSON function for other classes. So I should pass in kwargs, keyword arguments, to allow myself to receive, hey, this is a Google Docs thing. It's got Google Docs specific stuff. This is a Google Folder thing. It's got Google Folder specific stuff. And so I'm passing in kwargs. And so then it says, hey, I'm expecting you to pass in GDoc body into my from JSON. And GDoc body is a parameter of the GDoc. So if I set this to false, I have stuff that looks very similar to the standard Google Drive implementation. I have an ID, I have a name, I have the modified date, I have the URL. That's all standard to the Google Doc. I even have the parent list, which I'm thinking about getting rid of. But what I also have is I have stuff that's specific to the Google Doc, which is the Google Doc body, which is all this Google Doc content and whatnots. And then I have raw. Do I pass in raw? I do. Here, so raw. It's a response doc. Okay. In a nutshell, that's how the library works. We've covered a lot of ground. We looked at a tutorial for just how to sync my Google Drive content to my local folder and then like be able to upload it to GitHub or sync it to any place else that I want it to be. That was very powerful. We looked at a class called Google Drive File that allows me to interact with the Google Drive API and has some recursion built into it, and that's kind of cool. The reason why I wanted to take extra time on this, though, is that I'm really, in my own learning more about using inheritance to say, hey, this is a method that I want to recycle and parameterize or maybe use in different ways. And so I can use keyword arguments to say, hey, let's future-proof from JSON to allow my class instantiation to work with other child or offspring classes. We looked at this idea of super versus just normal get by ID that says, hey, for the Google Drive file, I need a function called get by ID, but I know I use get by ID everywhere. And so if I'm inheriting if I'm inheriting GDrive file for a class called GDoc, I might need to redefine how get by ID works. I want to overwrite it. If I want to overwrite it, but there's some boilerplate code that I don't want to write twice, I might have a private class method called super get by ID that I can call in GDoc. I think, I don't know that I've refactored Sheets, but I would do the same thing again. For Google Sheets, I would say, hey, I want to have a new class called Google Sheet. I want to have a function, a class method called get by ID that does Google Sheets specific stuff, but I want it based off of the Google Drive super get by ID function. So again, using this inheritance concept is very powerful, and we just get to do more and more sophisticated things with it. Man, that was a long ass tutorial. I hope that was helpful, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.